in the first tax bracket.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Liberals originally introduced this new system of tax breaks, they promised it would be revenue neutral. Shortly after taking office, however, they abandoned this promise. It is projected by the Parliamentary Budget Officer that Bill C-2's changes will cost Canadians $8.9 billion over the next 6 years. This gross miscalculation speaks to this government's incompetence and the fact that they are proceeding with this legislation after admitting they have broken this promise to Canadians speaks to their integrity. In fact, many of the government commitments seem to be falling by the wayside. A $10 billion deficit cap, consultation with opposition, openness and transparency, 3 months, 3 major broken promises, so much for sunny ways. This leads to a lack of trust in this government's future plans, lack of transparency with this promise. Who knows how much higher these costs will go? There's a lack of evidence or explanation for why Bill C-2's changes will stimulate economic growth and development for Canadians. Tax breaks for the middle class are not, in themselves, sufficient to stimulate economic growth and development. It is therefore quite likely that more initiatives will have to be introduced. These will require even more money from the government. This money will either have to be drawn from reduced spending on public services or from the taxpayers' base. Given the vulnerable economic state of Canada, tapping further into government revenue is particularly risky for this country as a whole and also for individual Canadians. The government continues to move ahead with these types of long-term commitments, even amidst a struggling economy, weakening dollar, and plummeting oil prices. Canadians are asking how much higher the costs will go. These kinds of commitments are one more chip into creating long-term structural deficits and, in turn, discourage investment and growth into struggling economy. Our Conservative government worked very hard every day in office to stretch every cent. We left this government a surplus and expected that to be spent with caution. It seems that work was all for nothing. The Liberals continue signaling that they plan to run massive, long-term structural deficits, which will increase the burden on taxpayers and leave Canada more vulnerable to sudden economic shocks. Our government caucus will continue to stand up for taxpayers and press this government to approach spending in a responsible manner to protect against risk, to ensure stability and long-term prosperity. Mr. Speaker, on the subject of changes to the tax-free saving accounts, all Canadians over 18 may contribute to TFSAs for all purposes, not just education and retirement savings. This makes this savings mechanism the most flexible way for all to save. It is because of this that many Canadians of all backgrounds have come to rely on tax-free saving accounts. We have heard from students saving for higher education, families saving to start a family, entrepreneurs saving for their business, parents saving for their children, and low-income seniors saving for retirement, all of whom are investing in TFSAs. And it's Canadians of all kinds of financial backgrounds too. The majority of TFSA accounts belong to low and middle-income earners. The fact is that 2/3 of TFSAs are held by tax filers with incomes less than $60,000. What kind of message do you think the government is projecting when they are taking away the ability for Canadians to save for their future while racking up massive deficits? Why does this government continue down a path of a nanny-state approach, limiting choice for Canadians to save their own money? These are not mandatory contributions. In contrast, the Ontario Liberal plan for a provincial pension plan is. If the argument is that very few Canadians have the ability to afford a maximum contribution, why is the member opposite so opposed to offering that choice, while in other instances forcing it upon others? Personal fiscal responsibility is something that our government should be encouraging, regardless if they refuse to lead by example. Mr. Speaker, we are in uncertain times with dropping commodity prices, a dipping dollar, and slowing economic growth. Recently, the PBO released a report on the state of household indebtedness and financial vulnerability in Canadians, showing that household debt servicing capacity continue to trend upward, while capacity to meet debt obligations diminishes. Households now face overwhelming exposure to negative income and interest rates and are more likely to become delinquent in debt payments. Responsible Canadians are looking for a way to save when times are good so they can be protected. Reducing TFSA contribution limits will reduce the abilities of real Canadians to save for retirement and to protect themselves from economic shock. This will translate to a greater burden on all taxpayers to support those who will be unable to support themselves. Why is the government hiding these future costs from its taxpayers? In contrast to liberal deficit spending, whose purposes are unclear, TFSAs provide a concrete vehicle for financial independence for Canadians. Instead of encouraging consumption, they encourage saving, promoting independent control over funds which shield Canadians from economic shock. The burden of economic shocks on vulnerable Canadians will ultimately fall on the overall tax-paying base if the government must step in and support these individuals. Money will come from taxpayers or public services will be compromised for the expense of increased government financial support. TFSAs remove barriers for all Canadians to maximize their financial positions. TFSAs are open for all Canadians over 18 years old and who have valid social insurance numbers. They are simple and accessible. Anyone can contribute any amount. They encourage financial literacy and curiosity. In fact, the majority of TFSA accounts belong to low and middle income earners. TFSA allows investments, any sort of investment, deposited into them to grow tax-free. TFSAs make retirement savings more accessible, simple, and compelling. If individuals do not save enough for retirement, all tax-paying Canadians will ultimately be responsible for the burden. The government's spending plans, including its nebulous deficits, are risky. We have seen no concrete evidence for targeted growth plans. Savings will shield vulnerable Canadians from the risks involved. Conversely, limiting saving tools will limit economic self-protection and make Canadians more economically dependent on the government. This is dangerous given the lack of clear economic plans and directions from the government. Government dependence will likely translate to higher taxes for Canadians across a wide socioeconomic spectrum. Mr. Speaker, in popular debate, the media, and in academic research, a brain drain out of Canada is cited as a very real possibility. Most doctors, lawyers, and other skilled professionals are found in upper tax bracket, and their departure could be very dangerous for Canada. Progressive taxation reduces investment, risk-taking, and entrepreneurial activities, since a large share of these activities is done by high-income earners. The substitution effect of principle that essentially states, I'm getting less money for each hour I work, therefore I should work fewer hours. Tax avoidance through reporting less income, using tax planning techniques to reduce the tax burden, working fewer hours, or even not seeking job promotions are very real possibilities. Progressive income taxes reduce the returns for education, since high incomes are associated with high level of education. They reduce incentives to build human capital, the kind of investment the Prime Minister talked up in Davos, while turning his back on our resources sector. Academic consensus among experts is that taxes on both corporate and promotional income are particularly harmful to economic growth, as economic growth ultimately comes from production, innovation, and risk-taking. Mr. Speaker, their conclusion is that tax rates over 50% will not raise revenue between provincial and federal income taxes for top tax earners. This is what would happen under Bill C-2. Mr. Speaker, I will not support Bill C-2. Thank you.